Berlin, early 1944. The winter light is thin and colourless over Wilhelmstrasse. Inside the Ministry of Propaganda, the air is thick with cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and the low hum of typewriters. Clerks move stacks of paper from desk to desk. Frontline reports, casualty summaries, radio scripts, and foreign newspapers that are never meant for the street outside. On a long table near the back of the room, a censor spreads out a new bundle of clippings, neutral press from Switzerland. A British paper intercepted through diplomatic channels, a thin, curling strip of photo wire. He works quickly at first, trained to search for phrases that can damage morale. Then his hand stops. On one grainy photograph, a knocked-out German self-propelled gun lies at an angle in a muddy lane. Around it stand infantry in unfamiliar battle dress, broad helmets, distinctive webbing, a small badge on a sleeve, a maple leaf. The caption is brief and precise. Canadian troops after capturing a German position in Italy. The man studies the ruined vehicle, the relaxed posture of the soldiers, the German prisoners blurred in the background. It is only one image among thousands, another frame in a war of paper, yet he understands at once that it does not fit the story they have been selling. To understand why that single photograph, and the many that followed, struck so hard inside Berlin, we have to step back and see the world those propagandists believed they controlled. In the first years of the war, the men in that Berlin building lived inside a carefully constructed world. Since 1933, Joseph Goebbels and his ministry had tightened their grip on almost everything a German could read, watch, or hear. Newspapers carried the same headlines. Radio voices repeated the same phrases. Newsreels in darkened cinemas showed carefully selected images. German columns advancing. Enemy troops surrendering. Flags rising over captured cities. Defeats were trimmed, delayed, or simply erased. The system had rules. Casualty lists were managed to avoid sudden shocks. The names of formations that had been destroyed were concealed behind vague phrases. When a front collapsed, newsreels showed maps with arrows straightened or shortened, not routes of retreat. The story was always the same. Setbacks were temporary. The Wehrmacht remained superior. The enemy was clumsy and divided. Within that picture, Canada barely existed as an independent actor. When Nazi speakers mentioned Canadians at all, they usually folded them into a blur of Anglo-American plutocracies, or British Commonwealth auxiliaries. The Empire, not the Dominion, was the unit. Canadians were portrayed as colonial troops, brave perhaps, but directionless. Used by London, supposedly led by decadent politicians and weak generals. Reality was different. From 1939 onward, Canada mobilized on a scale that surprised even some of its own citizens. A country of just over 11 million people would eventually put more than 1 million men and women into uniform. Shipyards along the Atlantic built corvettes and frigates. Factories turned out artillery, small arms, armoured vehicles, and the Canadian military pattern trucks that would appear in photographs from almost every Allied theatre. The Germans, however, first met Canadians not in Italy or Normandy, but in places where the outcome favoured the propaganda story. In December 1941, Canadian battalions fought in the doomed defence of Hong Kong. The garrison surrendered after a brutal struggle. For Berlin, this was proof that Allied colonial troops could be overwhelmed. In August 1942, Canadian forces led the raid on Dieppe. Tanks bogged down. Infantry were trapped under fire. Casualties were appalling. Propagandists seized on it as a symbol of Allied incompetence on the Western Front. Inside Germany, these early clashes fixed an image. Canadians as brave, perhaps, but expendable. A tool for British miscalculation. Their courage could be acknowledged without undermining the central myth of German tactical and moral superiority. What those same propagandists did not yet see was that, after Hong Kong and Dieppe, Canada would change how and where it fought, and that as Canadian units adapted, the cameras would follow them to very different kinds of battlefields. Those new battlefields began in the Mediterranean. In July 1943, Canadian troops went ashore in Sicily as part of the first major Allied landing in Europe. They fought through steep hills, heat, and exhausted German and Italian formations. The names of places, Leonforte, Agira, Regalbuto, meant little to people in Berlin, but for Allied planners they marked a pattern. Canadian infantry could make difficult attacks, hold ground under counterattack, and keep moving when the terrain and the enemy made every step costly. The campaign moved to the Italian mainland. By the winter of 1943-44, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade were pushing up the Adriatic side of the peninsula. Towns like Ortona were reduced to rubble, street by street, house by house. Canadian platoons cleared snipers, machine gun nests, and hardened positions. German reports from the front began to mention the Canadians, not as auxiliaries, but as main assault troops in some of the hardest fighting. The cameras were there. The Canadian Army had organised its own film and photo unit, sending trained photographers and cameramen forward with the troops. British and other Allied correspondents moved alongside them, working with cumbersome but reliable equipment. They captured moments that words alone could not convey. A section advancing through shattered masonry. A medic bent over a wounded man in a shell hole. A column of German prisoners trudging past Canadian sentries in wet greatcoats. These images did not stay at the front. Once developed and censored on the Allied side, they were transmitted by wire or shipped to London, Ottawa, and New York. Newspapers published them with straightforward captions. Canadian troops enter Ortona. German prisoners captured by Canadians in Italy. Canadian armour moves up under fire. Newsreels spliced film of these actions into weekly programmes shown in cinemas across the Allied world. By early 1944, a clear storyline had formed outside Germany. Canadians were no longer just a footnote to British operations. They were recognised as a national force within the Allied coalition. Their badge, the maple leaf, became a visual shorthand in photographs and film for patient, grinding, successful assaults on strong positions. Whether in Italian hill towns or along muddy river lines, the flow of material did not stop at Allied borders. Neutral states, particularly in Switzerland and Sweden, carried some of the same pictures and reports. Diplomats, businessmen, and foreign workers moving into and out of the Reich brought clippings with them. Intelligence agencies on all sides collected foreign press, studied it, and occasionally allowed selected images to circulate within their own bureaucracies. In Berlin, behind the controlled headlines and the official maps, a smaller, more discreet archive began to form. It contained images that did not match the story on the radio. Canadian troops standing where German units were supposed to be unbroken. Canadian vehicles parked in towns the Wehrmacht was meant to hold. Canadian officers inspecting captured German guns. To understand why these photographs unsettled the people charged with shaping Germany's dreams and fears, we have to examine them as they did, from multiple angles: human, tactical, technological, and psychological. The first angle is the most basic one, the human eye trying to make sense of an unexpected scene. For most Berliners, the war reached them as sound and paper. They heard it through radio speeches, read it in official communiques, saw it in newsreels already cut and approved. The front was a distant line, abstract and blurred. Only those who worked in certain offices saw the unfiltered images arriving from abroad. On a desk in a ministry building, a photograph of Canadian soldiers could look almost ordinary at first glance. Men in helmets, ruins, a captured gun. The war had produced millions of similar frames. But to someone used to scanning pictures for detail, the differences stood out quickly. The shape of the helmets, the style of the uniforms, the maple leaf insignia on shoulder patches or battle dress. In one image, Canadian infantry are shown moving cautiously through the rubble of an Italian street, buildings shattered on either side. In another, a long line of German prisoners snicks toward a collection point, their faces tired, their hands deep in their pockets against the cold, guarded by a smaller number of Canadians whose posture is alert but unconcerned. Even without reading the caption, the hierarchy in the picture is obvious. One side holds the weapons, the other does not. One side is moving forward through wreckage, the other is being moved. For a clerk, analyst, or officer in Berlin leafing through these images, there was a quiet dissonance. The propaganda they helped produce spoke of German liberation of Europe, of Wehrmacht resilience, of weak and divided enemies. Yet here were Canadians, often portrayed as peripheral to the real struggle, standing in conquered positions, escorting German soldiers into captivity, occupying streets the Reich had once announced as firmly held. The photographs did not shout. They did something more subtle. They invited the viewer to ask a question the radio never raised. If these are Canadian troops in this place, doing this work, what happened to the Germans who were supposed to be there? That question becomes sharper when we shift from the human angle to the tactical one, when we look at what the pictures reveal on the ground, frame by frame. From a tactical point of view, the photographs arriving in neutral newspapers and Allied reports were maps in disguise. Canadian divisions were often committed at hinge points in the Allied advance, where a river had to be forced, a fortified line cracked, or a town seized for its road or railway links. Combat photographers were instructed to document not just the men, but the terrain and the enemy positions. As a result, many images carried silent information any trained officer could read. One set of photographs from Italy might show Canadian troops fanning out beyond a shattered farmhouse, German anti-tank guns abandoned in the yard. Another, taken days later, captures Canadian engineers working on a temporary bridge across a rain-swollen river, wrecked enemy vehicles lying on the banks. The sequence reveals not just a moment of combat, but a pattern. A defensive line breached, a water obstacle crossed, a route opened. In Normandy, similar tactical clues appeared. Images from the area behind Juno Beach, taken after the 6th of June 1944, show Canadian infantry moving inland past disabled German strongpoints. Later photographs from the Battle for Caen capture Canadian armour nose-to-nose with knocked-out German tanks, or infantry advancing under the cover of artillery and villages reduced to rubble. To a civilian viewer, these might be scenes of chaos without context. To staff officers in Berlin tasked with monitoring foreign press, the details were clearer. They could match church towers, bridges, and road junctions in the pictures to maps on their tables. They could see in a single frame that a Canadian unit now held ground the Wehrmacht claimed to control, or that German heavy weapons had been destroyed or abandoned. Even when the images were tightly cropped, certain things could not be hidden. The direction of movement, the condition of equipment, the presence or absence of organized resistance. A column of Canadian infantry advancing with tanks and support suggested momentum and coordination. German prisoners standing in an orderly line, guarded but unharmed, suggested a breakdown in local command, but not in Canadian discipline. Every such photograph, taken on its own, could perhaps be dismissed as a local reverse. One bridge lost, one village overrun, but the cumulative effect over weeks and months was different. When Canadian units appear repeatedly at key points where the front is shifting, across rivers, through fortified belts, in ports and road hubs, the tactical story inside the pictures becomes hard to reconcile with the narrative of a stable, superior German defense. That recognition was keenest among the people whose job was to turn military reality into public story, the propagandists and censors themselves. From the perspective of Nazi propagandists, the enemy's photographs were not just images. They were problems. Within the propaganda ministry and the higher commands, there were departments whose job it was to monitor foreign media. They collected Allied broadcasts, neutral newspapers and intelligence summaries, trying to anticipate how the enemy presented the war. The goal was to counter, distort or suppress those narratives before they seeped into German society. When photographs of Canadian victories began appearing in that material, the first reaction was procedural. They were logged, clipped, sometimes annotated. Analysts compared them with internal situation reports from the front. If a photograph showed a bridge, town, or stretch of countryside, officers familiar with the sector could often identify it. In some cases, they could even recognize details such as unit markings on captured German vehicles or the uniforms of prisoners. The difficulty lay in the consistency of what the images showed. Suppose an internal report described a flexible withdrawal or a shortening of the line after heavy fighting. The corresponding foreign photograph, however, showed Canadian troops dug in beyond the position that was supposed to have been held. Another report might speak of fierce resistance and heavy enemy losses in a contested town. A neutral newspaper photograph from the same place showed Canadian infantry resting in doorways, the only visible German presence being prisoners led away under guard. For propagandists accustomed to trimming or timing news to soften the impact of defeat, this created a new kind of pressure. The photographs were independent data points. They originated outside German control and circulated in channels the regime could not fully seal. Diplomatic pouches, intelligence exchanges, smuggling networks. Inside the ministry's offices, that meant the people tasked with crafting headlines and radio bulletins now had to write in the shadow of images they could not publicly acknowledge. They knew, for example, that Canadian units had played a central role in breaking a particular line in Italy, or in holding a corridor in Normandy. They could see that in the photographs spread out on their tables. Yet the public narrative might mention only enemy forces or Anglo-American units, avoiding any suggestion that a Dominion force had bested key German formations. The shock for many of these men did not come from one single photograph, but from the realization that Canada, rarely at the center of their pre-war worldview, kept appearing at the heart of reverses they were supposed to explain away. Each new image of Canadian troops standing where German troops had once stood was another reminder that the story of invincibility was becoming harder to sustain. The images also carried a deeper threat. They showed an enemy that was not only advancing, but doing so with a level of equipment, organization, and confidence the propaganda line had long denied. To understand that aspect, we have to look at what the photographs revealed about Canadian technology and industrial power, and how those details turned pictures into quiet warnings. In almost every photograph, beyond the soldiers themselves, there was another layer of information that spoke directly to industrial strength. Canadian troops did not move alone. Behind them in the frames were vehicles, guns, and equipment that hinted at a deep production base an ocean away. Rows of Canadian military pattern trucks, built in factories in Ontario and elsewhere, appear in the background of many images from Italy and northwest Europe. To a casual viewer, they were just trucks. To a trained observer examining the foreign press, they were evidence of a logistical network that the propaganda line had long tried to minimize. A single photograph might show a column of Canadian vehicles nose to tail along a muddy road, loaded with ammunition and rations, their cabs crowded with soldiers in greatcoats. Another might capture a gun position where Canadian artillery crews stand by well-maintained pieces, stacks of shells, orderly and abundant around them. In urban scenes, armoured vehicles marked with Canadian tactical signs nose through rubble, passing damaged or abandoned German equipment. For years, Nazi rhetoric had portrayed the democracies as decadent societies lacking discipline, will, and staying power. Industrially, they were sometimes derided as capable of quantity but not quality. Yet the images of Canadian formations suggested something else. Well-equipped units, operating far from home, keeping up pressure in difficult terrain. The vehicles were standardized, the supply lines evidently functioning. There was no sign of the disorganization or shortage that official speeches claimed to see in the enemy camp. In Berlin, officers and analysts who understood logistics could read these cues. They knew how many miles of road and how many tons of material were needed to keep one division fighting. When they saw Canadian columns in both Italy and France, supported by dense layers of transport and artillery, they could infer the larger truth that a medium-sized Dominion had become a war factory, feeding not just its own forces but, through shared production, the Allied armies as a whole. From a propaganda perspective, that presented a silent contradiction. The Reich had urged its citizens to think of themselves as an embattled, technically superior fortress facing crude, clumsy adversaries. The photographs of Canadian forces, taken by Allied cameras but examined in German offices, showed instead a modern, organized military backed by robust industry. The pictures were not only proof of battlefield success, they were snapshots of an industrial contest that was turning against Germany. If the technological details hinted at a deeper imbalance, the way the photographs were used by the Allies added yet another layer. They were not just records, but deliberate tools in a psychological struggle. The Allied governments understood that images could travel where speeches could not. Throughout the war, the British and Canadians dropped leaflets over German lines and cities, broadcast on shortwave radio, and pushed stories into neutral press with the expectation that some of that material would slip into the Reich. Photographs of Canadian victories became useful in this context because they carried multiple messages at once. A leaflet showing Canadian soldiers escorting German prisoners, for example, did more than report a tactical success. To German soldiers who picked it up in a trench or a ruined village, it implied that surrender to Western troops might mean survival and humane treatment. To civilians who heard about such images through rumor, it suggested that the enemy was advancing steadily despite official claims. In neutral newspapers, editors sometimes chose the most striking pictures to accompany short, factual reports. Canadian flags painted on vehicles, shoulder badges with maple leaves, and captions explicitly naming Canadian forces made it clear who was responsible for particular breakthroughs, even if the accompanying text was restrained. The visual emphasis told its own story. These were not anonymous Allied troops, but a specific national contingent achieving recognizable gains. German authorities tried to counter this flow. Possession of enemy leaflets or unauthorized foreign newspapers could bring punishment. Security services investigated defeatist talk linked to foreign broadcasts or press. Yet the very need for such measures was an acknowledgement that images and stories were crossing borders despite censorship. Inside institutions like the propaganda ministry, the photographs served as warning lights. Reports from the secret police occasionally noted cases of workers or soldiers discussing enemy pictures they claimed to have seen, even when the exact source could not be traced. The fact that such conversations were happening suggested that the outer membrane of the information system was thinning. To the men tasked with maintaining the regime's narrative, each Canadian victory image that slipped through was not only a reflection of military reality, but a potential spark of doubt in the minds of those they were trying to keep convinced. It showed German troops yielding ground, Canadian troops taking it, and a war that no longer matched the map on the cinema screen. The Allies, meanwhile, increasingly emphasized Canadian contributions in their own messaging, reinforcing the idea that the Reich faced not just one or two major powers, but a coalition whose individual members could each deliver decisive blows. By 1944, Canadian successes were no longer buried in general references to British forces in Allied communications. Dispatches from Italy and Normandy named divisions and brigades, praised specific units, and highlighted the national identity of the troops involved. Newspapers in London and Toronto carried headlines that placed Canadians in the subject line of victory stories. Canadian troops break through in Italy. Canadians advance beyond Juno. Canadians help close the Falaise pocket. Newsreels narrated by familiar voices framed these operations as proof that Canada, despite its size, had become a leading contributor to the Allied offensive in the West. For Nazi propagandists monitoring this material, the shift in emphasis was uncomfortable. Before the war, many had barely considered Canada in strategic terms. Even in 1940 or 1941, when Canadian troops stood guard along British coasts or deployed to secondary theatres, the Dominion could be treated as a symbol of imperial weakness. Now, however, Allied media were presenting Canadian units as spearheads in operations that forced Germany to retreat on multiple fronts. The more often photographs of Canadian troops appeared beside headlines about key advances, the harder it became to dismiss their role as marginal. In Italy, they were shown driving through the dust of broken defensive lines. In Normandy, they appeared in ruined villages and along hedgerow-lined roads that once led toward German-occupied territory. In the Scheldt, later in 1944, images captured them slogging through flooded lowlands to clear the approaches to Antwerp. In Berlin's offices, the cumulative effect of this Allied emphasis and the supporting imagery was to underline a simple fact that official German broadcasts could not acknowledge. The Reich was being pushed back not only by the United States and Britain, but also by a dominion whose soldiers and industry had been underestimated. All these angles, human, tactical, industrial, and psychological, converged in a critical period when Canadian victories followed one another in rapid succession. The photographs that recorded them began to arrive in Berlin not as isolated curiosities, but as a steady stream. It was in that period that the shock felt by Nazi propagandists turned into a deeper recognition that their narrative might not survive contact with the images on their own desks. To see this turning point clearly, we need to step into that narrow window of time when the lines on the map bent sharply, and Canadian troops, again and again, appeared at the hinge of the German retreat. By the spring of 1944, the war had reached a point where isolated reverses could no longer be disguised as local incidents. Canadian formations stood in the centre of that shift. In Italy, the line that mattered in May was not a name for the public, but a reality on military maps. The Hitler Line, a chain of bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields and concrete positions strung across the Liri Valley, designed to block the route to Rome. German commanders believed it to be one of the strongest defensive belts in the Italian campaign. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 5th Canadian Armoured Division were tasked with breaking it. The fighting that followed was brutal and methodical. Canadian infantry advanced through fields torn by shell fire. Engineers pushed forward under machine gun and mortar bursts to clear mines and fill tank traps. Armour tried to thread through narrow lanes between blown bridges and cratered roads. Casualty lists grew, yet position by position, the line buckled. The Canadian Film and Photo Unit was there. Their cameras recorded infantry sheltering behind low stone walls before an assault. They captured Shermans edging past shattered farmhouses. German guns lying silent in the foreground. They photographed, in stark detail, German prisoners herded back from the broken line, walking past Canadian units that had finally forced a crossing. Those images did not stay in albums at the front. They were wired back, developed, and printed in Allied newspapers. Captions named the formations. Canadian troops breach Hitler line. Canadian armour moves forward through gap in German positions. In some shots, the terrain was recognizable to anyone with access to Italian maps. The implication was clear. A supposedly impregnable defensive system had been cracked, and Canadian units were at the point of the spear. Within weeks, attention shifted north. On the 6th of June 1944, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade landed on Juno Beach in Normandy. The first hours were costly. Strongpoints poured fire onto the sand. Anti-tank guns claimed their share. But by the end of the day, Canadian forces had pushed inland farther than many expected, linking up with British units on their flanks and securing a solid bridgehead. Again, the cameras were close. Photographers came ashore behind the first waves, working under fire or in the immediate aftermath. Their pictures showed Canadians wading through surf past obstacles and wreckage. They captured men taking cover behind sea walls, then pushing inland through villages scarred by shelling. They recorded German prisoners lined up on the beach, guarded by Canadians whose uniforms were still wet with seawater. In the days that followed, the film rolls filled with scenes from the struggle for the ground behind Juno. Canadian infantry moved through fields cut by hedgerows. Tanks advanced in tight lanes, their crews scanning for anti-tank positions. The town names, Courseulles, Bernières, Saint-Aubin, appeared beneath photographs in Allied newspapers and on the screens of newsreels. Maps on cinema screens traced arrows inland from a section of the Normandy coast labelled simply Juno. For people in Allied cities, the story was one of hope and momentum. For the analysts in Berlin tasked with reading foreign press, the same images carried a heavier, more technical weight. They showed Canadian units firmly ashore, with artillery, armour and supplies building up behind them. They showed German prisoners taken on French soil the regime had once declared part of a permanent new order. By July, further photographs from Normandy added to the pattern. Scenes from the battle for Caen, the surrounding villages, showed Canadian troops fighting through shattered streets, taking ruined farmyards, and holding ground under counterattack. In some frames, knocked-out German tanks lay in ditches or courtyards, while Canadian infantry picked their way past. From the Hitler line in Italy to the hedgerows behind Juno, a sequence emerged. In sector after sector, Canadian formations appeared at the point where German lines had been broken or bent back. The photographs, arriving in Berlin through neutral channels and intelligence reports, gave that sequence a face and a landscape. Together they sketched a turning point in which the old narrative of invincibility no longer matched the scenes on the page. The military crisis on the map was becoming an information crisis inside the offices where the war's story was supposed to be controlled. Inside Berlin, the tension around those images did not explode in public. It settled instead into memoranda, marginal notes, and quiet conversations behind doors that stayed closed. In the propaganda ministry and the various information sections of the Wehrmacht and party, officers and civilian specialists compared the official situation maps on their walls with the foreign press spread across their desks. The arrows on the German map still emphasized resistance, counterattacks, and stabilized fronts. The photographs told a different story in black and white. One report might summarize the loss of a position in Italy as the result of enemy pressure, leading to a planned shortening of the line. Yet a neutral newspaper clipping, attached by a staff officer, showed Canadian infantry standing in front of German bunkers, clearly built as part of a supposedly secure defensive belt. Another internal document might describe fighting in the Caen sector as fluid, with references to local counterstrokes. A foreign photograph, taken days later, captured Canadian armour parked in a village street with German vehicles burned out nearby. The Canadian crews relaxed enough to pose briefly for the camera. The problem for propagandists was not that these images were widely seen by ordinary Germans. They were not. The problem was that they circulated among the very people who had to craft the story the public would hear. Speechwriters, editors, radio producers and senior officials now worked with a double vision: the sanitized battlefield on the evening broadcast, and the more brutal, more specific landscape in the photographs lying on their tables. Attempts to reconcile the two realities followed familiar patterns. Canadian achievements were buried under generic references to Anglo-American forces. When an entire defensive position collapsed, announcements stressed the supposed numerical or material superiority of the enemy, not the skill or persistence of the Canadian units that had actually forced the break. In some cases, emphasis shifted to other fronts altogether, particularly the East, where references to heavy fighting could be used to explain strain without admitting Western weakness. Yet as 1944 wore on, the gaps became harder to disguise even in internal documents. The same Canadian units appeared in too many critical places. In Italy, their presence was noted at the Hitler Line and in subsequent pushes up the peninsula. In Normandy, Canadian divisions and brigades appeared again and again in the heavy fighting for villages, ridges and road junctions around Caen, and later in operations leading toward the Falaise pocket. In the autumn, photographs from the Scheldt campaign recorded Canadians battling through flooded lowlands to clear the approaches to Antwerp, a port whose use by the Allies would have direct consequences for Germany's supply situation. Within the circles that handled this information, a reluctant recognition spread. The war against the Western Allies was no longer a contest the Reich could plausibly portray as under control. The images of Canadian soldiers, anonymous faces under steel helmets, maple leaves on their sleeves, had become recurring markers of German positions lost, German troops captured, German plans overtaken. For the propagandists, the shock described later by some participants was not theatrical. It was the cumulative effect of watching a narrative they had spent years building erode under the steady drip of photographic evidence. Each new batch of foreign newspapers and photo wires raised the same uncomfortable task: to turn a sequence of defeats, some of them inflicted by a dominion once treated as minor, into a story that still promised eventual victory. The distance between the lens at the front and the microphone in the Berlin radio studio had never seemed so wide, and as Canadian formations continued to advance through Italy, France, and the Low Countries, that distance would only grow, with consequences that reached far beyond the offices where those photographs were first unrolled. In the months after those photographs began to circulate inside offices and intelligence files, the war on the ground and the war in people's minds moved in different directions, but they were tied together by the same images. On the Western and Italian fronts, German field units did not need foreign newspapers to tell them who they were facing. Reports and post-war recollections from officers and soldiers show that Canadian formations earned a reputation for determined attacks and stubborn defence. Units that had faced Canadians in Sicily, Ortona, Normandy or the Scheldt learned to expect assaults that did not stop with the first reverse. When orders mentioned Canadian divisions in the opposing line, commanders understood that they were dealing with troops accustomed to hard fighting in difficult terrain. That knowledge filtered back through letters and casual remarks in rest areas. Even when censorship cut out explicit references to locations or unit names, hints remained. A soldier might write home about heavy attacks by Commonwealth infantry, or difficult fighting against colonials, in a way that family members later associated with the offensive news they heard from foreign broadcasts after the war. The precise overlap is hard to trace, but the overall pattern is clear. The front was retreating, and Allied pressure, often including Canadian units, was part of the reason. Inside Germany, civilians sensed the shift without seeing the photographs pinned to office walls in Berlin. They felt it in the tightening of rationing, the increasing number of air raid sirens, the growing lists of missing and dead. Official bulletins still spoke of heroic defense and inflicted casualties. But the tone grew more strained. References to enemy superiority in men and material appeared more often. The promise of decisive German counterstrokes on the Western Front faded as the months went by, and no miracle reversed the direction of the arrows on the maps. For those working within the information apparatus, the gap between the official line and the material on their desks widened into a kind of quiet professional crisis. In private, some admitted after the war that by late 1944, they no longer believed in the possibility of victory in the West. The photographs of Canadian troops in Italian valleys, Norman villages, and flooded Dutch polders were part of that realization. Each new image of German prisoners under Canadian guard, each shot of Canadian artillery firing from freshly captured positions, underlined how far the situation had moved beyond what could be convincingly reshaped for public consumption. At the same time, the regime reacted by tightening control. Possession of foreign newspapers became more dangerous. Listening to enemy radio was punished more harshly. The harsher the penalties, the more obvious it became that the leadership feared not just enemy tanks and bombers, but stories and pictures that contradicted their own. By the time Canadian units were fighting on the approaches to Germany's borders, the photographs that had once stunned a small circle of specialists in Berlin had become part of a larger pattern, a visual record of relentless pressure on a regime that was running out of ways to explain its losses. When the fighting ended and the Reich collapsed in 1945, the photographs took on a different life. In the first months after surrender, Allied investigators seized documents, films, and photographic collections from ministries, military offices, and propaganda units. Among the piles of German material were also folders of foreign press clippings and enemy pictures that had been monitored during the war. In some cases, the very images of Canadian troops that had once circulated quietly in Berlin as a problem for propagandists now lay on tables as evidence of how accurately the outside world had recorded Germany's defeats. At the same time, Allied archives formalized their own collections. The Canadian Army's photographs, once rushed to newspapers and newsreels, were catalogued, labelled, and stored. Prints showing Canadians in the Leary Valley, wading ashore at Juno, advancing through Caen, or slogging through the flooded fields of the Scheldt were filed with dates, unit identifications, and locations. Over time, they became standard illustrations in official histories and regimental accounts. Former German propagandists, officers, and civilians encountered some of these images again under very different circumstances. In war crimes trials, documentary films used captured German footage alongside Allied photographs to show the progression of the conflict. In early post-war books and exhibitions, pictures of Canadian troops standing in formerly German-held towns formed part of a visual narrative of liberation and collapse. For those who had once tried to manage or suppress such images, seeing them projected in courtrooms or printed in volumes about the fall of the Reich underlined how completely control had slipped away. In Canada, the same photographs contributed to a growing public understanding of the country's role in the war. Families looking at albums, newspapers, and later television documentaries saw familiar surnames and hometown units linked to distant landscapes. The images fixed certain notions in the national memory. Canadians as assault troops in Italy, beachlanders in Normandy, canal crossers in the Low Countries. They reinforced the idea that a medium-sized country had fought above its weight in some of the hardest campaigns in the West. For Germans born after the war, the photographs appeared in textbooks and museum displays, stripped of the old rhetoric. Captions now spoke of aggression, occupation, and defeat. Where wartime propaganda had presented German soldiers as invincible defenders of Europe, the images showed them as prisoners on roads lined with Canadian guards, or as fleeting silhouettes in ruined cities the Wehrmacht ultimately failed to hold. In that sense, the photographs completed a journey. Once examined in secret by men trying to protect a crumbling narrative, they became public records used to explain how that narrative collapsed. The same Canadian victories that had once unsettled propagandists in Berlin now stood, in print and on screens, as reference points in a wider story about power, truth, and the limits of control. From this distance, it becomes easier to see that the real significance of those images lies not only in who they show, but in what they reveal about the relationship between war, perception, and memory. In the end, the photographs outlived the men who tried to control them. A single frame freezes a moment that no order can rewrite. A German gun, silent and split open. A Canadian soldier, face turned toward the camera for a heartbeat before he moves on. Prisoners on a muddy road. A church steeple leaning over a ruined square. None of these things ask permission from a ministry in Berlin. Light hits film, shapes appear, and the record exists. Dictatorships bet heavily on the idea that if you shape the story, you shape reality. For a time, that can seem to work. Maps can be drawn differently. Headlines can be delayed or softened. Words like withdrawal and straightening the line can be used to describe a retreat. But the camera is indifferent to vocabulary. It shows who is standing and who is sitting in the back of a truck with their hands in their pockets. For Canada, that mattered. In a war dominated by larger powers, the photographs made its contribution visible in a way that could not be brushed aside. They captured Canadian troops at the hinge points of a collapsing empire, holding bridges, storming beaches, cutting through flooded fields. Long after speeches faded, those images remained as quiet proof that a dominion far from Berlin helped push the Reich back toward its own borders. For the rest of us, the journey of those photographs is a reminder that control over information is never complete. Even in a tightly managed state, fragments of truth leak through. A blurred background figure, a caption in a neutral paper, a print slipped into a file. Decades later, those fragments become the backbone of how we remember. Somewhere in an archive drawer, that grainy picture of Canadians standing by a wrecked German gun still exists. It is no longer a problem to be hidden, but a piece of evidence, showing not only who won a particular fight, but how, in the long run, reality caught up with the story told in Berlin. If this story of truth breaking through propaganda mattered to you, take a moment to like this video. It helps keep these forgotten moments alive. Subscribe to Canadian Legacy for more real, carefully researched stories from the world wars, told without myth and without noise. And if you have a connection to this history or a story that deserves to be remembered, share it in the comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering.